Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Civics. And today we're going to talk about the rest of the amendments to the Constitution. Remember, in the last video we talked about the first 10, which are in the Bill of Rights, and now today we're going to talk about Amendments 11 through 27. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. Amendment 11, right after the Bill of Rights, is number 11. And 11, basically, the gist of that one is that individual states cannot be sued by out-of-state citizens and foreigners. So let's say someone came to visit America from another country and they were in, let's say, New York, and something happens to them and they want to sue. They can't sue the state of New York. They can't take legal action against an individual state. Instead, they have to sue the United States. So that's basically what they're saying, is that the federal government will back up individual states in cases against foreign entities. So that's what 11 is about. So before that, I'm pretty sure there was a Supreme Court case where a foreign citizen sued an actual state, and they decided, well, that shouldn't happen again. So they changed that. Number 12 happened actually right in the 1800s, and it revised the way presidential elections are going to work. So originally, the way the presidential election would work is that everybody who wanted to run for president would say they were going to run, and then there would be an election, and then whoever won was president, but then whoever came in second place had to be the vice president, which kind of became an issue. So if you were the president and the guy who just ran against you, may have said some pretty nasty things about you or whatever, could end up being vice president. So take that to a modern day example. If in 2016, when President Trump won, if we did it the old way, then Hillary Clinton would be the vice president in that administration. That doesn't seem like a very healthy way moving forward to run a government. So what they did was they made it so that the president and vice president run together as a ticket. So the two of them are together. That made that kind of thing wouldn't happen anymore. So that was Amendment 12. They decided that they needed to revise that system a little bit. Amendment 13, now we have to wait all the way until after the Civil War for the 13th Amendment. Remember, Amendment 12 happened in like 1804. Okay? Amendment 13 happened after the Civil War. And Amendment 13 abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. So we finally say no more slavery in the United States. We get rid of that in law, officially in writing. Now, it doesn't actually work out quite that way, but that's what it's supposed to do. And then it also said, though, that involuntary servitude can be a punishment for a crime, and that's come up recently. All those wildfires in California, they have firefighters who are prisoners fighting fires, and they are technically involuntarily serving, right, as firefighters. Some of them get to volunteer, but some of them don't. And so that's now becoming kind of an issue too. It's like, are they gonna try to change it so that that's not a thing anymore? The 14th Amendment came pretty quick, soon afterwards. They realized that because of the end of the Civil War, they needed to do some things. So you would need to define citizenship. So that they did that. They defined what citizenship in the United States is. And then they said that after that, states cannot make laws that abridge the rights of those citizens. So an individual state can't make a law that basically says, well, I know that you said that these are what citizens are, but we're not going to follow that. It also says that all citizens are granted due process. So that means that anybody who now is defined as a citizen gets due process under the law. It also explicitly states, right, that under the law everybody is protected. And then they also solve some other Civil War issues. Like they say that if you fought in an insurrection against the United States, you can't become president anymore. So anybody in the Confederacy couldn't run for president, stuff like that. That was all in the 14th Amendment. In the 15th Amendment, they had to talk about the rights to vote, because at that time, black people were not allowed to vote. And so the 15th Amendment says that everybody can vote, no matter what race you are, no matter what color your skin, or if you were ever a slave. So none of those things could bar you from voting. Obviously, in the South, they found ways around that, so they would instead institute other ways to stop those people from voting. but they couldn't directly say that they couldn't because they were black. That was the 15th Amendment. The 16th Amendment allows Congress to pass income taxes without apportioning it amongst the states or basing it on the census. So that means that they can create any kind of income tax that they want. Beforehand, there were certain restrictions on what Congress could make a tax on for income. This amendment made it so that it doesn't matter. You can just make an income tax, and we still have the income tax today. So it's still part of our system of government. The 17th Amendment made it so senators were now popularly elected. Up until this point, when the amendment was passed, senators were not elected, they were appointed. So it was much more important to control a state legislature because the state legislatures and the governors were the ones who got to appoint the senators. So from then on, senators had to be elected. Amendment 18 banned the sale and manufacturing of alcohol. It was a huge win for the temperance movement in the United States. And that actually led to a lot of issues. So they banned making and selling alcohol, and everybody was like, but we like that. So a lot of illegal activity rose. A lot of the popular gangsters like Al Capone and people like him, they became gangsters because they were creating alcohol and selling it. So that kind of created this whole underworld of illegal activity. So not so great. Not our best amendment. Amendment 19, it prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on sex. So that made it so that now women across the country could vote. However, it is misconstrued often. They say that, it's like, oh, women could vote after the 19th Amendment. That's not 100% completely true. White women could vote after the 19th Amendment. Black women, women from the Native American tribes, Asian women, they were all still denied the right to vote in several different ways. That didn't change until much later. So the 19th Amendment was a big step forward, but it wasn't complete the way that a lot of people frame it as. Amendment 20 changed the date that the new president takes office, so that instead of it happening, I don't remember when it happened before, but now it happens in January, so it's at the beginning of a year. And then it establishes that if the president-elect dies before he takes office, the vice president-elect is inaugurated as the president instead. So it's basically just saying, hey, if we elect this guy president or this girl and they die before they can take office, the person that was running as vice president will take their spot instead. So kind of a good little safekeeping thing to have just in case something bad happens. The 21st Amendment gets rid of the 18th Amendment. That's literally what it is. It repeals the 18th Amendment and says that was a dumb idea. We're gonna get rid of that. So now alcohol is now allowed. And as you can probably see, if you watch a football game or baseball, really any sports game, right? They advertise alcohol like crazy on there. So clearly it's still legal. We haven't gone back on that one. However, they did make it so it's now a federal offense to transport or import alcohol if it is illegal somewhere. So there are some states who still wanted to hold on to those laws about being illegal to have alcohol or make alcohol in that state. So they said, if it's illegal in the state, you can't bring it in there. It's a federal offense. Amendment 22 came after the presidency of FDR. Because FDR had 4 terms as our president. So up until FDR, there was kind of this like unspoken rule that you didn't be president for more than 2 terms. And that was established by George Washington. So George was president for 2 terms, and then he stopped and he gave up his power and he let somebody else be president. Now, George Washington absolutely could have continued to be president for the rest of his life, and I don't think anybody would have complained about that. But the reason he decided to give up his power and not be president anymore is because he wanted to establish the precedent of people peacefully giving up power and handing it over to the next person. At that point in America, or at that point in the world when George was president, there were other countries that were trying to experiment with democracy as well who were having issues with that exact thing. So for instance, in France, people were leading and then they weren't giving up their power. And so he wanted to make sure that didn't happen in the United States. So he set that precedent. Now, the first president to not do that then was FDR. And FDR, to be fair, he had a lot going on and he had a lot to accomplish. And he did accomplish a lot as president. And it took him 3.5 terms to do it before he passed away in office. And so then after that, they're like, well, we probably shouldn't let that happen anymore. So they codified into the law that unspoken rule that you could only be president for 2 full terms. They did, however, say, so let's say that you were the vice president and the president dies like in his 3rd year in office and you become the president. They make it so that you can still run for 2 full terms afterwards. So you can be president for 2 full terms or for 10 years in total. So they did allow it for people who took office in the middle of a term to still get their 2 full terms, as long as it wasn't too early in the presidency. The 23rd Amendment made it so that the District of Columbia got electors in the Electoral College, because before that, they weren't allowed to have electors. So people who lived in D.C., they didn't have a voice in who was president, which is kind of a bummer, because the president pretty much oversees that whole area. It's under the federal jurisdiction. So it would be kind of nice that they had a say in that. So that was what the 23rd Amendment was. The 24th Amendment fixed some of those voting issues that I talked about, where they were still denying people of color from voting. It eliminated what's called a poll tax. And so that was one of the ways that Southerners had found around the race issue. And basically what they did is they made like a test that was impossible to pass. And they would give it to people, mostly who were black. They wouldn't give it to white people. And they would say, well, if you can't pass this test, then you can't vote. And so they made it so that basically people couldn't do that. Either that, or they would just straight up make them pay for it. So they would be like, yeah, you got to pay $50 to get your ballot. And for like a white family, that was easy to do. But for black families, because of Jim Crow, it was not easy. And so blacks were denied the right to vote because of that. So they got rid of that. So you can't pay a fee to vote. You don't have to be asked to pass a test. You just get to vote because you're a citizen. That's the 24th Amendment. The 25th Amendment established some procedures for the succession of the presidency. Basically, it made it so that if the president does die, we'd have a direct line of succession of who becomes president. So the way it works in general is the first person, right, is the president, and then if the president dies, the vice president is the person who steps into that role. Now, after that, let's say the president and the vice president both die. In that case, the next person to become president is the Speaker of the House. And that's because they are the leader that is the most popularly elected. After that, it's the president of the Senate, not the president pro tempore of the Senate. So it's not the VP, because he's the president of the Senate. It's the leader of the Senate basically gets to be the next person. And then after that, it's cabinet positions. So whenever the whole government is getting together for one big meeting, so for instance, like the State of the Union, they always pick somebody to not be there just in case something bad happens. And they always say it too. So like, basically, like, they'll be at the State of the Union and they'll be like, yes, the whole government's here except for the head of the Department of State. And that's because they're in a bunker somewhere in case someone blows up the Capitol. And that's basically the reason why. It's because they want to make sure that if something terrible happens, something truly horrific happens, and the entire government is wiped out, there's still someone who can be the president. There's another important part of the 25th Amendment that's actually being relevant right now, in October of 2020. And that's what happens if the president is no longer able to fulfill his duties. So he's still alive, but he can't be president right now because he's sick or he's got some issues. This amendment allows for either Congress or the members of the cabinet to basically remove the president from power until he's healthy enough to become president again. And there's a lot of talk right now about what's going to happen if President Trump gets that way because of his coronavirus diagnosis. So there's a possibility that the 25th Amendment will actually be used for during this year. We'll have to see what happens. Probably not. The election's coming up. It might just end up, the election happens and then we'll move on from there. But there was some, President Reagan got into trouble for this because there was one point when he had a stroke and the government hid it from us. And it's basically his wife was running the government while he was recovering. And people didn't really like that. People think that they should have used the 25th Amendment in that instance. 26, that allowed people who were 18 and older to vote. So up until that point, depended on the state, but you pretty much had to be 21, sometimes a little bit older, sometimes a little bit less. And so they basically established that if you're old enough to be in the military and fight for your country, you're old enough to vote. And that was the reasoning behind it, because people were being, recruited into the military at 18, but they weren't allowed to vote to decide who was sending them to war. So they decided that it was important that 18-year-olds were allowed to vote. And now the final amendment, the last one that's been passed, this was in 1992, the year I was born. Congress cannot raise their salary for their own term of Congress. So the current group of congressmen, right, who are all it's going to change once the election happens in November. If they pass a bill that says that they're going to get more pay, that doesn't go into effect until after the election. And that's because they didn't want people, the Congress, to just continuously increase their pay as they were in charge. This amendment, actually, it was passed in 1992, but it was proposed all the way back in the 1700s. So it took like 200 years for this amendment to pass, which is pretty cool. So some amendments have like a limit on how long they have to be successful. This one didn't, and so it took 200 years for this to happen, which is pretty sweet. There are still some amendments that are being worked on. There's a lot of people who talk about how we need to be amending the Constitution for different things, but none have really gained the momentum or the traction to get going. So still working on it. But those are the amendments that have been passed so far. In our next episode, we're going to start talking about the specific stuff about, what are we talking about next time? Now I feel unprepared. Hold on. Notes. We're going to talk about the cabinet next meeting, all the different departments the president runs and what they do. So we know kind of what the president is in charge of and all the things that he delegates to other people. Good thing I keep notes. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy the video. See you next time. Bye.